Every woman failed the Alpha King's challenge, the council elder sneered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the marble-clad hall. 73 claimants, all broken. David, you ask the impossible. Alpha King David stared at the blood-streaked remnants of the trial floor, his jaw clenching. I ask for an equal. If our future demands an unbreakable queen, I will not settle for glass masquerading as diamond. In the shadows of the servants' alcove, Lisa gripped the edge of her silver tray, her knuckles white. She wasn't unbreakable. As a quiet Omega, she was conditioned to be invisible, meant only to serve. But as she watched the next arrogant Alpha heiress stride toward the brutal arena, Lisa knew exactly what they were all missing. The challenge didn't require strength. It required surrender. The sprawling penthouse suite of the Obsidian Tower felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully gilded cage. High above the neon-lit grid of the city, the modern headquarters of the Silverwood Pack was a testament to how far their kind had evolved. Gone were the days of forest skirmishes and moonlit howling. Today, pack politics were waged in boardrooms, stock markets, and silent, devastating displays of dominance. Yet, for all their technological and financial supremacy, the ancient laws remained absolute. The Alpha King needed a queen, and the law demanded she prove her worth through the trial of the Abyss Stone. David stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in his sharp, amber eyes. He was 32, bearing a physical stillness that masked a lethal, coiled energy. He didn't look like a man who had just watched his 73rd suitor collapse in agonizing defeat. He looked, to the untrained eye, entirely indifferent. But the slight tremor in his right hand, the one resting heavily against the cool glass, betrayed the mounting desperation gnawing at his ribs. Behind him, the heavy oak doors of the proving room groaned shut. The medics had already whisked away Lady Victoria of the Northern Ridge. She had lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes before the psychological weight of the Abyss Stone had driven her to her knees, screaming at phantoms only she could see. She will recover. Marcus, David's beta and chief counsel, murmured from the doorway. Marcus adjusted his tailored suit, his face a mask of weary pragmatism. Physically, at least. Her pride is another matter. That's the 3rd alpha female this week, David. The council is growing restless. Let them, David replied, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the large room. He turned away from the window, his gaze sweeping over the proving room's antechamber. They offer me soldiers when I need a tether. They offer me ambition when this pack requires empathy. The stone requires dominance, Marcus argued gently, stepping further into the room. It holds the collective trauma, the raw, unfiltered instinct of our entire lineage. Only a will of iron can suppress it. Then why do the iron-willed keep shattering? David countered, walking toward the center of the room where the stone rested on a raised obsidian pedestal. It wasn't a stone, not truly. It was a dense, crystalline meteor, pulsing with a faint, iridescent violet light. It fed on the energy of the room, vibrating with a low frequency that made the air feel thick and metallic. As David stared at the artifact, he failed to notice the silent figures slipping through the servants' corridor. Lisa moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent her entire life surviving by going unnoticed. Dressed in the simple, tailored gray uniform of the estate's archival staff, she carried a damp cloth and a bucket of ionized water. Her assignment was to clean the antechamber after each trial, erasing the physical evidence of failure, scuff marks, dropped jewelry, and occasionally blood. She kept her head bowed, a curtain of soft chestnut hair falling forward to shield her face. To be an Omega in the Silverwood Pack was to be a ghost. Society deemed them too soft, too emotionally fragile for leadership, relegating them to domestic or administrative roles. Lisa had learned early on that her deep, profound empathy, the hallmark of her Omega nature, was viewed as a liability. It made her vulnerable to the aggressive emotional currents of the alphas around her. But as she knelt near the pedestal, wiping away a smear of Victoria's blood, Lisa didn't feel vulnerable. She felt the stone. It wasn't screaming at her, as the alphas claimed. It was weeping. She paused, the damp cloth hovering inches from the polished floor. The violet pulse of the crystal seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. A wave of profound sorrow washed over her, not her own, but the ancient, compounded grief of generations of wolves who had lived and died in brutality. The alphas tried to crush this sorrow with dominance, fighting a tsunami with their bare hands. Lisa closed her eyes, letting out a soft, barely audible breath. She didn't push the feeling away. She simply acknowledged it, wrapping her quiet consciousness around the chaotic energy like a soft blanket over a frightened child. For a fraction of a second, the stone's violent pulsing smoothed into a steady, gentle hum. "Who are you?" The voice was like thunder in the quiet room. Lisa gasped, her eyes flying open. Her hand jerked, knocking the small metal bucket. Water spilled across the marble. She scrambled back on her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked up. Alpha King David was standing barely 4 feet away. His amber eyes, usually so guarded and cold, were narrowed, fixed intensely on her. He wasn't looking at the spilled water. He was looking at the stone, and then back to her, a flicker of raw, unrestrained confusion crossing his features. The silence that stretched between them felt heavy enough to crack at the marble floor. Lisa's instinct, honed by 24 years of survival, screamed at her to lower her gaze, to apologize profusely, and to vanish into the periphery. "Forgive me, sire," Lisa whispered, her voice barely a scrape against the quiet hum of the room. She immediately dropped her chin, her hands moving frantically to mop up the spilled ionized water. "I tripped. I will be out of your way in a moment." David did not move. He stood perfectly still, his tall, broad-shouldered frame casting a long shadow that engulfed her. He was close enough now that she could catch his scent. Pine needles, petrichor, and beneath it, the sharp, metallic tang of profound exhaustion. "Leave the water," David commanded. The tone wasn't a yell, but it carried an undeniable weight that forced her hands to stop. "Stand up." Lisa hesitated for a fraction of a second before slowly rising to her feet. She kept her eyes focused on the top button of his dark dress shirt, refusing to meet his gaze. Meeting an alpha's eyes, especially the king's, during a moment of tension, was a direct challenge. "What did you just do?" David asked, taking a slow step closer. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift, pressing against Lisa's chest. "I spilled the water, sire. I was clumsy," she replied, keeping her voice incredibly flat, a technique she used to hide the natural, melodic fluctuation of her Omega tone. "Not the water," David said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The stone." Lisa's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the damp cloth. "I don't know what you mean, Alpha." David analyzed her. He took in the plain gray uniform, the lack of any scent markers indicating rank or dominance. She smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper, the scent of the archives. She was an Omega, a low-tier worker. By all biological and societal laws, standing this close to the abyss stone while it was still agitated from a failed trial should have induced a panic attack in her. Yet her pulse, while elevated from his sudden presence, lacked the erratic, jagged rhythm of terror. More importantly, David hadn't imagined it. For 3 seconds, the crushing psychic noise that the stone radiated, a noise that had been giving him a migraine for a week, had vanished. It had gone utterly, peacefully silent the moment this girl had closed her eyes. "Look at me," David said softly. Lisa swallowed hard. Defying a direct command was impossible. Slowly, she lifted her chin. When her eyes met his, David felt a strange jolt in his chest. Her eyes were a striking deep hazel, flecked with gold. But it wasn't the color that arrested him. It was the absolute, startling depth of understanding within them. There was no fear, no ambition, no desire to impress him. She looked at him the way one might look at a wounded animal, with cautious, heavy sorrow. In that split second, fragments of Lisa's past threatened to surface. The memory of her mother, a strong Omega who had tried to soothe a frenzied pack member and had been torn apart for her weakness. The vow Lisa had made to never let her empathy become a target. She slammed the mental doors shut, forcefully blanking her expression. "I am just the archivist, sire," Lisa said, her voice steadying. "I clean the room. I don't touch the stone." Before David could press further, the heavy doors opened behind them. Marcus re-entered, followed by 2 members of the Elder Council. "David, the Council demands a review of the parameters," Elder Thorne announced, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifetime of smoking and shouting. "We have 5 more claimants arriving tomorrow. If the stone's frequency isn't adjusted," Thorne stopped, noticing Lisa standing near the king. His upper lip curled in immediate distaste. "What is a servant doing in the proving bounds? Get her out of here. The residual energy will break her mind." David's gaze lingered on Lisa for a moment longer. He saw the way she instantly shrank into herself, her posture transforming from quietly dignified to subservient and small. It was a flawless act of submission. But David knew what he had felt. "Go," David said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. Lisa bowed her head, clutching her bucket, and practically melted into the shadows, disappearing through the servant's door without making a single sound. "She was just cleaning," David said, turning his attention back to the council. But his mind was no longer on the politics of the pack. As Thorne began to drone on about bloodlines and strength, David's attention drifted back to the abyss stone. The violet pulse had returned to its chaotic, angry rhythm. The silence was gone, and for the first time in his reign, King David realized he was desperate to hear that silence again. The final day of the trials was a spectacle of high anxiety. The obsidian tower was locked down. The air conditioning pumped crisp, cold air into the proving room, but the atmosphere remained stiflingly thick. The abyss stone was reacting to the collective tension, its violet glow turning a bruised, volatile crimson. Lisa stood on the mezzanine level, hidden behind a thick velvet curtain meant to obscure the service pathways. She had traded shifts with a beta worker who was too terrified of the stone's ambient energy to work the upper floor. Lisa's chest ached with a dull, rhythmic throb. The stone was hurting. It was a mirror reflecting the pack's desperation, and today, that desperation was toxic. Below her, the arena was prepped. The final contender for the week was Lady Serafina, a warrior caste alpha known for her ruthless military precision. She wore tactical black, her face painted in a mask of lethal focus. "She plans to dominate it through sheer psychic force," Lisa murmured to herself, watching Serafina crack her knuckles. "She's going to crack it." Lisa gripped the velvet curtain. An Omega's intuition was rarely wrong regarding emotional physics. Forcing will upon compounded grief didn't erase it. It pressurized it until it exploded. King David sat on the elevated dais, his posture rigid. He looked worse today. The dark circles under his amber eyes were pronounced, and the muscles in his jaw ticked with repressed strain. Every time a claimant failed, a portion of the stone's chaotic backlash hit the Alpha King, tethered as he was to the pack's core energy. He was absorbing their failures. "Begin," David ordered, his voice echoing over the intercom. Serafina stepped into the marked circle. Immediately, the crimson light flared, illuminating the room in a blood-red wash. The low hum of the stone escalated into a shrill, vibrating whine. Serafina planted her feet, baring her teeth as if facing a physical opponent. She threw her hands forward, unleashing a wave of alpha dominance, a psychic command meant to force the stone into submission. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Instead of dimming, the stone shrieked. A shock wave of pure kinetic energy blasted out from the pedestal. The reinforced glass windows lining the room spider-webbed with a deafening crack. Serafina was thrown backward as if struck by a freight train, slamming into the marble wall and crumpling to the floor, unconscious. Chaos erupted. The council elders shouted, scrambling backward. Sirens began to wail. But the worst was happening in the center of the room. The stone's energy had fractured. It was spiraling out of control, a localized hurricane of psychic pressure that began tearing chunks of marble from the floor. "Evacuate," Marcus bellowed, trying to reach the dais, but David didn't retreat. He leapt down from the dais, his eyes flashing a brilliant, glowing gold. He shifted halfway into his alpha state, his claws extending, his muscles tearing through his tailored suit. He was going to try and contain the blast himself, to shield his pack, even if it meant his own mind would be torn apart by the vortex. From the mezzanine, Lisa felt the air pulled from her lungs. The sheer agony radiating from the stone was blinding. It was the sound of 1,000 wolves crying out in terror and pain. David was marching into a meat grinder. His strength wouldn't save him. It would only give the stone more fuel. "You must remain invisible," her mother's voice whispered in her memory. "Visibility is death for our kind." Lisa looked at David. He was 10 feet away from the stone, leaning forward as if walking into hurricane-force winds, blood trickling from his nose. If he died, the pack fractured. If the pack fractured, thousands suffered. Lisa let go of the curtain. She didn't run. Running was an act of prey, an act of fear. She walked. She bypassed the service stairs, stepped over the low railing of the mezzanine, and dropped lightly onto the main floor, landing in a crouch. The room was deafeningly loud, the wind howling, papers and debris flying through the air. No one noticed the gray-clad archivist walking calmly into the epicenter of the storm. As Lisa crossed the threshold of the proving circle, the kinetic wind tore at her hair and clothes. The psychic pressure slammed into her, a wave of despair so heavy it threatened to drop her to her knees. She felt the grief of lost mates, the terror of hunted ancestors, the crushing burden of survival. She didn't fight it. Instead, Lisa let out a soft, melodic breath. She opened her arms slightly, her posture completely devoid of defense. "I feel you," she projected outward, tapping into the deep, hidden well of her Omega nature. "I hear you. You don't have to fight anymore." David, struggling against the tempest, saw a flash of gray step past him. He reached out to grab her, a roar tearing from his throat. "Get back!" But Lisa ignored the king. She stepped directly in front of the blinding red light of the abyss stone and placed both of her bare, trembling hands directly onto the violently vibrating crystal. The moment Lisa's bare skin made contact with the abyss stone, the world did not explode. It imploded. The roaring, kinetic wind that had been tearing the proving room apart vanished in a fraction of a second, leaving a vacuum of sound so profound it made David's ears ring. The violently spinning debris, shards of reinforced glass, shredded velvet, and chunks of marble, hung suspended in the air for one agonizing heartbeat before plummeting to the ground in a cacophony of clattering ruin. But David barely heard the crash. His glowing amber eyes were fixated entirely on the small, gray-clad figure in the center of the devastation. Lisa stood with her hands pressed flat against the jagged surface of the crystal. The blinding, volatile crimson light had instantly retreated the moment she touched it. In its place, the stone began to pulse with a color David had never seen in his lifetime. A soft, luminescent silver, like the reflection of a full moon on a still lake. For Lisa, the silence in the room was a stark contrast to the deafening roar inside her mind. The moment she connected with the artifact, centuries of suppressed pack trauma flooded her nervous system. It was a torrential river of grief, fear, and the primal agony of loss. She felt the phantom bite of traps, the sorrow of mates torn apart, the crushing burden of alphas who had died trying to carry the weight of their people alone. It was enough to shatter a mind. It was enough to stop a heart. But Lisa did not fight it. She didn't raise a mental shield, nor did she attempt to dominate the current as the 73 alpha women before her had done. Instead, she became an ocean. She let the jagged, sharp emotions flow into her, diluting their acidity with the vast, quiet depth of her natural empathy. "I see you," she thought, projecting the sentiment into the crystal. "You are not alone. You can rest now." The stone vibrated against her palms, no longer a weapon, but something that felt distinctly like a tired, shivering animal seeking warmth. The silver light intensified, washing over Lisa's face, illuminating the tear that slid silently down her cheek. Behind her, the elders were beginning to pick themselves up off the floor, coughing through the settling dust. Elder Thorn wiped a trickle of blood from his forehead, his eyes widening in absolute, visceral horror as he took in the scene. "Witchcraft," Thorn breathed, his voice trembling. "Get her away from it. She's corrupting the core." David didn't wait for the guards to move. His alpha instincts, usually a cold, calculating force, were screaming in utter disarray. The crushing psychic weight that had been giving him migraines for weeks was entirely gone. His mind felt terrifyingly clear, but his chest was tight with a sudden, inexplicable panic. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. "Lisa, let go." She didn't hear him. The physical toll of filtering centuries of trauma was rapidly catching up to her human frailty. The silver light pulsed one final, brilliant time, and then the stone went completely, utterly dark. It was the first time in Silverwood history the artifact had powered down. The sudden severing of the connection hit Lisa like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, her eyes rolling back as her consciousness surrendered to the overwhelming exhaustion. She never hit the floor. David caught her, his large arms sweeping under her knees and behind her shoulders. She weighed practically nothing. As her head fell against his chest, the scent of her, vanilla, old paper, and the sharp tang of ozone, filled his senses. Her skin was freezing cold, yet a strange, residual warmth radiated from her core. "Sire, step away from her," Marcus urged, limping slightly as he approached, his usually immaculate suit torn at the shoulder. "We don't know what she just did. The stone is dead." "The stone is resting," David growled, the low, vibrating timbre of his voice halting Marcus in his tracks. David looked down at the unconscious Omega in his arms. Her face was pale, devoid of the submissive mask she wore so perfectly. In her vulnerability, she looked incredibly strong. "Take Lady Seraphina to the medical wing," David commanded, not looking up as medics finally breached the room. "And the archivist?" Thorn sneered, dusting off his lapels. "Throw her in the holding cells. She has tampered with sacred pack artifacts. The penalty is exile." David's head snapped up. His eyes flashed a dangerous, predatory gold, locking onto Thorn with a promise of absolute violence. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "The archivist," David said softly, his voice echoing in the ruined hall, "is coming with me." The rhythmic, electronic chirp of a heart monitor was the first thing to pierce the heavy veil of Lisa's unconsciousness. She didn't open her eyes immediately. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as if her bones had been replaced with lead. But the air around her was wrong. It didn't smell of the damp, subterranean chill of the servants' quarters. It smelled of expensive antiseptic, fresh linen, and, overpowering everything else, the rich, intoxicating scent of pine needles and petrichor. The king. Lisa's eyes snapped open. She expected to see the holding cells. Instead, she found herself in a sprawling, sunlit suite. The bed she lay in was massive, draped in high-thread count sheets. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, placing her high in the upper echelons of the obsidian tower. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She scrambled to sit up, her hand instinctively ripping the IV tape from her arm. I wouldn't do that. Your electrolyte levels were dangerously low. Lisa froze. In the corner of the room, sitting in a leather armchair that seemed too small for his frame, was Alpha King David. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing the intricate dark ink of his pack tattoos winding up his forearms. He looked exhausted, yet entirely focused on her. "Sire," Lisa gasped, immediately trying to swing her legs over the side of the bed to kneel. "I apologize. I don't know how I—" "Stay in the bed, Lisa," David commanded. It was a gentle order, but the alpha cadence beneath it made her muscles lock in place. She sat back against the pillows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her eyes glued to the pristine white duvet covering her lap. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "You've been unconscious for 2 days," David finally said, his voice a low rumble. "The pack is in chaos. The elders are demanding your head. And my chief counsel is advising me to quietly relocate you to a different continent with a heavy severance package." Lisa swallowed hard. "I will pack my things immediately, sire. I meant no disrespect. I couldn't stand the screaming anymore." "The screaming," David repeated softly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. 73 alpha females claimed the stone was screaming at them. They tried to scream louder. They tried to break it. He paused, studying the delicate slope of her shoulders. "What did you do to it?" "I didn't do anything," Lisa whispered. "I just listened." David stood up, the sudden movement causing Lisa to flinch slightly. He walked slowly toward the bed, stopping a few feet away. "Explain it to me. Make me understand how an unranked Omega managed to neutralize a psychic weapon that broke the strongest warriors in our pack." Lisa finally looked up. The gold flecks in her hazel eyes caught the afternoon sunlight. The terror was still there, but beneath it was a quiet, unyielding resolve. This was the same look she had given him before stepping into the storm. "You view the stone as a weapon, Alpha," Lisa said, her voice trembling but clear. "Because alphas view the world through the lens of conquest. If something is powerful, you believe it must be dominated or destroyed." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "The stone isn't a weapon," she continued, her hands gripping the duvet. "It's a graveyard. It holds the memories, the pain, and the terror of every Silverwood wolf who died violently. When your claimants pushed their dominance into it, they were essentially attacking wounded animals. The stone defended itself." "And you?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am an Omega," Lisa said, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. It was a word that had defined her limitations her entire life. "I don't have dominance. I only have empathy. I opened the door, and I let them know they were safe. You can't conquer grief, sire. You can only sit with it until it passes. David stared at her. The profound simplicity of her words dismantling decades of packed dogma in his mind. He looked at her hands, so small and fragile, yet capable of holding an ocean of sorrow without breaking. He stepped closer, reaching out. Lisa braced herself, expecting a reprimand. But instead, David's large, calloused hand gently touched the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You healed it," he murmured, his amber eyes searching hers. "You healed the stone." "It's just resting," she replied, breathless. "No," David said, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "It wasn't just the stone. For the first time since I took the crown, my mind is quiet." Before Lisa could process the raw vulnerability in the king's confession, the heavy oak doors to the suite flew open. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face pale, ignoring the breach of protocol. "David, you need to come to the council room, now." "I told you I wasn't to be disturbed," David growled, his protective instincts flaring as he stepped between Marcus and the bed. "It's the pack," Marcus said, his voice tight with panic. "The stone is dormant, yes. But without its baseline frequency, the psychic tether connecting the pack is fraying. The alphas in the lower city are rioting. The elders are demanding a blood sacrifice to wake it back up." David's blood ran cold. He looked back at Lisa. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, horrifying realization. They didn't just want her exiled anymore. They wanted to feed her to the stone. The Obsidian Tower's subterranean council chamber felt more like a crypt than a boardroom. Carved directly into the bedrock of the city, the circular room was dimly lit by suspended iron braziers. Today, the shadows felt suffocating. The 12 elders of the Silverwood Pack sat in their high-backed chairs, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, sweat, and unbridled aggression. Outside these walls, the pack was losing its mind. The sudden absence of the Abyss Stone's hum had created a psychic vacuum, leaving the alphas erratic and the betas deeply paranoid. "We warned you, David," Elder Thorne spat, slamming his fist onto the stone table. "That Omega severed the connection. She used a suppression tactic to deafen the stone, and now our people are suffering withdrawal. She must be brought to the altar." "You mean executed," David said. He stood at the head of the table, his posture radiating lethal stillness. He had changed back into his formal black suit, the very image of a ruthless sovereign. But inside, his chest felt hollow. "We mean sacrificed," another elder corrected smoothly. "Her blood will jumpstart the crystal. It is a necessary cost for the survival of the many. She is just an Omega, a disposable asset." A low, terrifying growl began to vibrate in David's chest, a sound so primal it made the braziers flicker. Several elders leaned back in their chairs, instinctively exposing their throats in a display of submission. "The next man who calls her disposable will lose his tongue," David said, his voice deadly calm. "You cannot protect her, David," Thorne shouted, emboldened by the sheer desperation of the situation. "The law is clear. She interfered with a sacred trial. If you do not hand her over, the council will vote to unseat you. The pack is tearing itself apart. We need a queen who can control the stone, not a maid who broke it." The heavy steel doors at the back of the chamber groaned open. Every head turned. Lisa stood in the doorway. She was no longer wearing the gray archivist uniform. Marcus, under David's strict, secret orders, had provided her with garments befitting a higher station. A simple, elegant black dress that fell to her mid-calf, paired with sensible, flat shoes. She looked small against the massive frame of the doorway. But as she stepped into the room, she did not lower her head. The ambient tension in the room, which had been buzzing like a live wire, instantly shifted. The elders frowned, rubbing their temples. Just her presence in the room seemed to absorb some of the chaotic, aggressive energy spiking off the older wolves. "Who let her out of the medical wing?" Thorne demanded, rising from his seat. David walked around the table, his eyes fixed on Lisa. He offered her his hand. It was a highly symbolic gesture. For an Alpha King to offer his hand to an Omega in front of the council was a declaration of absolute equality. Lisa hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding her. He led her to the center of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. "You demand a queen who can control the stone." David addressed the room, his voice ringing with absolute authority. 73 of your finest warriors failed. They failed because they relied on dominance. This pack has become obsessed with strength, forgetting that a foundation built entirely of rigid iron will eventually snap under pressure. He raised Lisa's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "The stone isn't broken. It is pacified," David declared. "And the woman who pacified it stands before you. I am invoking the right of the claim. Lisa is my chosen claimant for the crown." Complete, stunned silence blanketed the crypt. Even Thorne seemed to stop breathing. The audacity of the statement was incomprehensible. An Omega Queen? It went against thousands of years of biological and social hierarchy. Madness. Thorne finally hissed, his face turning a mottled purple. Absolute madness. You would put a weak, sniveling creature on the throne while our pack fractures? She is stronger than any Alpha who stepped into that room, David fired back, his eyes glowing gold. Then let her prove it. Thorne snarled, a wicked, triumphant gleam suddenly appearing in his eyes. He looked at the other elders, a silent agreement passing between them. The law states that if a king invokes the right of the claim against the council's wishes, the claimant must survive the blood moon hunt. Marcus, standing near the back, dropped his tablet. The clatter echoed loudly. "Elder Thorne, you cannot be serious. The hunt is designed for Alphas in their prime. It's a death sentence for an Omega." "If she is strong enough to be queen," Thorne smiled, revealing slightly elongated canines. "She is strong enough to survive the northern ridge. 3 days. No supplies. Hunted by the elite guard." David's grip on Lisa's hand tightened to the point of pain. His muscles coiled, preparing to leap across the table and tear Thorne's throat out. Before David could issue a challenge, Lisa gently squeezed his hand. She looked at Thorne, her hazel eyes completely devoid of the fear the elder was so desperately trying to instill. "I accept the terms," Lisa said quietly. David whipped his head to look at her, horror flashing in his amber eyes. "Lisa, no, I accept," Lisa repeated, looking up at the king. Her expression was serene, grounded by a quiet, immovable truth. She wasn't an Alpha. She couldn't fight them, but she knew something the council didn't. Omegas didn't survive by fighting. They survived by adapting, and the forest had always been kinder than the city. The dropship hovered 50 feet above the jagged, snow-dusted canopy of the northern ridge, the deafening roar of its rotors stripping the ancient pine trees of their needles. The metal ramp lowered with a mechanical groan, exposing the freezing, biting wind of the wilderness. Lisa stood at the edge of the ramp, her simple black dress whipping violently around her legs. She had been given a heavy wool cloak, a standard provision for the blood moon hunt, but no boots, no weapons, and no compass. She looked down into the dark, yawning expanse of the forest. To an Alpha, this was an arena. To an Omega, it was a graveyard. 3 days, claimant. The drop master shouted over the engines, his face devoid of sympathy. The elite guard will deploy in 1 hour. Survive until dawn on the 3rd day, and the crown is yours. May the first wolf watch your step. Lisa didn't nod. She simply stepped off the edge. The fall was steep, but she didn't fight gravity. She angled her body, crashing through the upper branches of a massive spruce, letting the thick, springy boughs slow her descent before she hit the damp, mossy forest floor with a breathless thud. She rolled, absorbing the impact, and immediately lay perfectly still. Above her, the drop ship banked sharply and roared away, taking the modern world with it. The oppressive, ancient silence of the northern ridge rushed in to fill the void. She had 1 hour. And Alpha would use this time to run, to put as much physical distance between themselves and the hunters as possible, relying on stamina and speed. But Lisa knew the mechanics of a hunt. Speed left tracks. Fear left a scent. Sweating, heavy breathing, and a racing pulse were beacons to the highly trained predators of the elite guard. Lisa sat up, wincing at the sharp sting of a scratched cheek. She stripped off the heavy wool cloak. It smelled of the Obsidian Tower's antiseptic laundry, a foreign, unnatural scent in these woods. She buried it beneath a thick layer of rotting leaves and damp earth. Next, she dug her bare hands into the cold mud, pulling up handfuls of dark, pungent loam and smearing it over her arms, her neck, and her face. She found a cluster of bruised pine needles and crushed them between her palms, rubbing the sticky, fragrant sap into her hair, masking the soft, vanilla scent of her omega biology. True invisibility isn't about not being seen. Her mother's voice whispered in her memory, a fragment of a lesson taught in the cramped, airless servants' quarters a decade ago. It is about being entirely uninteresting to the predator. Become the dirt. Become the tree. Lisa didn't run. She walked. She moved laterally across the steep incline of the mountain, her bare feet silent on the damp moss. She kept her breathing slow, intentionally dropping her heart rate to a sluggish, rhythmic thump. She tapped into the vast, quiet well of her empathy. But instead of reaching for trauma, she reached for the forest. She felt the slow, sleepy hum of the ancient roots, the erratic, tiny spikes of fear from burrowing rabbits, the cold, steady indifference of the stone. She wrapped this ambient energy around herself like a shroud. 50 minutes later, a deep, resonating howl shattered the twilight. The hunt had begun. Lisa crouched beneath the hollowed-out roots of an overturned oak tree. She closed her eyes and let her empathy drift outward, sweeping the forest like a silent radar. She felt them immediately. 5 distinct emotional signatures, burning hot with adrenaline and alpha dominance, fanning out across the ridge. But as she focused on the nearest signature, Captain Silas of the Elite Guard, a chill that had nothing to do with the snow settled deep in her bones. She didn't feel the thrill of a capture. She didn't feel the competitive drive to subdue a claimant. She felt cold, clinical intent. She felt the heavy, metallic taste of premeditated murder. Thorne hadn't sent them to hunt her. He had sent them to assassinate her. The realization hit her not with panic, but with a profound, terrifying clarity. The rules of the trial were a facade. If they caught her, there would be no submission, no dragging her back to the council in defeat. They were going to bury her out here. Lisa opened her eyes. The shadows of the forest seemed to lengthen, twisting into jagged teeth. She couldn't just hide for 3 days. To survive an executioner, she had to stop being prey. In the highest tier of the Obsidian Tower, Alpha King David was tearing his own world apart. The glass walls of his private study were completely shattered, the remnants sparkling like diamonds on the plush carpet. His massive mahogany desk was overturned, its contents strewn across the room. He paced the length of the space, his breathing ragged, his eyes flashing a volatile, luminescent gold. It had been 4 hours since the dropship returned. For 4 hours, David had stood by the windows, staring out at the distant, jagged silhouette of the northern ridge, feeling an agonizing phantom pain in his chest. The pack tether, usually a chaotic hum in the back of his mind, was terrifyingly quiet without the abyss stone. But in that silence, a new, delicate thread had formed. A fragile, silver connection tethering his soul to the quiet Omega in the woods. "David, you must control yourself," Marcus pleaded from the doorway, stepping carefully over the broken glass. The beta held a decrypted tactical tablet in his trembling hands. "If the council sees you in this state, they will declare you unfit. They are already drafting the articles of succession. Let them burn the articles," David snarled, his voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying octave. He stopped pacing and turned to his chief counsel. "Tell me you have the guard's telemetry." Marcus swallowed hard, his face pale. "I bypassed the council security grid. I accessed Captain Silas's private comms." He hesitated, looking down at the tablet. "David, Thorne issued a shadow directive before they boarded the transport. Silas was promised a seat on the Elder Council." David's entire body went terrifyingly still. The violent kinetic energy radiating from him suddenly compressed into a dense, suffocating gravity. "For what?" "For ensuring the claimant suffers a fatal accident," Marcus whispered. "They aren't hunting her, David. It's a hit squad. They've turned their biometric trackers off. They're going to kill her, and there will be no proof it wasn't the elements." The fragile silver thread in David's mind throbbed with a sudden, distant echo of cold realization. Lisa knew. "Evacuate the medical wing," David commanded softly, unbuttoning the cuffs of his ruined suit shirt. "Why?" Marcus asked, confused. "Because when I return with her, I am going to put Elder Thorne in intensive care," David replied, his voice devoid of heat, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "And then I am going to dismantle the council." "David, the law," David interrupted, his bones beginning to crack and reshape as the alpha shift overtook him, "was written by cowards who fear the silence." Within seconds, the king of the Silverwood Pack was gone. In his place stood a massive, midnight black wolf, its eyes burning with apocalyptic fury. He didn't take the elevator. He launched himself through the empty window frame, plummeting toward the lower terraces, hitting the ground in a dead sprint toward the northern mountains. Miles away, deep in the frozen darkness of the ridge, Lisa was climbing. She was bruised, her feet bleeding from the jagged slate, but her mind was fiercely lucid. She had led Silas and two of his guards away from the denser forest, navigating entirely by emotional echolocation. She could feel their frustration mounting. They were tracking a ghost. She left no scent, no broken branches, no signs of panic. She lured them toward Whisper Gorge, a treacherous, narrow ravine where the wind funneled through the rock formations, creating a constant, shrieking howl that masked all sound. The ground here was unstable shale, loose and highly dangerous. Lisa reached the edge of the gorge and finally stopped. She didn't hide. She stood out in the open, the pale moonlight illuminating the mud smeared across her face. She turned her back to the precipice and waited. 10 minutes later, the tree line broke. Captain Silas stepped out, his tactical gear blending with the shadows. He held a high-powered tranquilizer rifle, though Lisa knew the darts had been replaced with lethal nightshade rounds. He saw her, and a wave of smug, cruel satisfaction washed over his emotional signature. "End of the line, Omega," Silas sneered, raising the rifle. Lisa didn't flinch. She locked her hazel eyes on his, her face an unreadable mask of calm. "You are tired, Captain," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly over the shrieking wind. Silas paused, his finger hovering over the trigger, caught off guard by her utter lack of submission. "What? I can feel it," Lisa said, taking a slow step toward him, away from the edge. The crushing weight of trying to be strong enough for the council. The constant paranoia. The exhaustion of proving your dominance every single day. "Shut up," Silas growled, his heart rate spiking. "You don't want to kill me," Lisa whispered, projecting a massive, localized wave of pure, unfiltered empathy directly at him. It was the same oceanic peace she had given the stone. "You just want to rest." The psychic wave hit Captain Silas like a physical blow to the chest. He staggered back, the rifle dipping in his hands. The aggressive, murderous intent that had driven him up the mountain evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. His mind, conditioned for brutal hierarchy and constant conflict, was entirely unprepared for absolute, unconditional acceptance. For the first time in his life, Silas felt the profound, aching exhaustion of his own existence. His knees buckled. A choked, confused sob tore from his throat. He looked at Lisa not as prey, but as the only solid ground in a collapsing world. "How are you doing that?" Silas gasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, the rifle slipping from his grasp to clatter against the shale. "I am just listening," Lisa said softly, stepping closer. Before Silas could drop entirely to his knees, a deafening, earth-shattering roar ripped through the gorge. The sound was so massive, it seemed to vibrate the marrow in Lisa's bones. From the dense tree line behind Silas, a gargantuan black wolf exploded into the clearing. David didn't waste time shifting. He moved with the raw, unstoppable velocity of a freight train, his jaws snapping toward the back of Silas's neck. The Alpha King had tracked the scent of Thorn's treachery, and his mind was consumed by a singular, blinding need to annihilate the threat to his mate. "David, stop!" Lisa screamed, her voice cracking the stillness she had so carefully built. The command was laced with her Omega resonance, a desperate, pleading frequency that slammed into David's alpha instincts. The massive wolf skidded on the loose shale, tearing deep gouges into the earth. He stopped mere inches from Silas, his jaws dripping with saliva, his golden eyes locked onto the elite guard. A low, terrifying growl rumbled in David's chest, demanding blood. Silas was frozen, caught between the paralyzing empathy of the Omega and the imminent, brutal death brought by the Alpha King. He exposed his throat, whimpering in absolute submission. Lisa didn't run away from the beast. She walked directly toward the snarling black wolf. "It's over," Lisa said gently, reaching out. David snapped his jaws, a warning born of pure adrenaline and protective rage. He was lost to the beast, consumed by the terrifying thought of what would have happened if he had been 5 minutes later. Lisa didn't pull her hand back. She stepped directly into his space, pressing her small, mud-stained palms against the thick, coarse fur of his massive neck. She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of the silver, calming energy she possessed through her hands and into him. "I am here," she projected into his chaotic mind. "I am safe. You do not need to fight for me." Slowly, the tension drained from the massive wolf's frame. The terrifying growls faded into heavy, shuddering breaths. Right before Silas's awestruck eyes, the beast began to shift, bone and muscle reknitting until Alpha King David knelt naked in the freezing snow, his arms wrapping desperately around Lisa's waist, burying his face in her stomach. "I have you," Lisa whispered, stroking his dark hair, looking down at the most powerful man in the city as he shook with the aftershocks of his own terror. She looked up at Captain Silas. The elite guard was on his knees, staring at the impossible scene. He had witnessed the king yield, not to a stronger alpha, but to the gentle, unyielding strength of an Omega. "Captain Silas," Lisa said, her voice carrying the undeniable authority of a queen. "Go back to the Obsidian Tower. Tell the council the Blood Moon hunt is over." Silas didn't hesitate. He bowed his head until his forehead touched the freezing shale. "Yes, my queen." If you enjoyed this cinematic tale of hidden strength, pack politics, and undeniable devotion, please hit the like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more dramatic romance fiction. Let us know in the comments what you loved most about Lisa's quiet power.